Today we're going to talk a little bit about how to analyze and think about the American Revolution. Now, this lecture won't be directly about the American Revolution. We're not going to go over the course of the war. That's going to be in a future lecture. But right now, I want to take the opportunity to set up a potential analytical framework you might want to employ as you think about and look at the American Revolution as we move through this topic, all right? Because there's a lot of material and different sources this time around. And I just want you to have something I want you to keep in mind. And again, I kind of want to lift the veil a bit on academic history and explain some of the ways historians arrive at certain analytical frameworks, right? What goes into it, what inspires them, and what conditions it. And so the first thing I want to talk about is talking about the American Revolution from a military history standpoint. The American Revolution is a war, right? And it definitely comes under a large part of it military history. And, you know, military historians are sometimes a bit of a breed apart from general academic historians. In fact, for a long period of time, there was a real divergent point between, you know, kind of these sort of hardcore focused military historians and other academic historians, you know, and they don't always stay completely, you know, bipolar. They will mix and merge, but there is some division in terms of what they look at. And traditionally, you know, for a long period of time, a military historian would be very, very interested in grand strategy, in technology and weaponry, in logistics, right? And you might even be as broad as looking at industrialization and distribution and communication and supply lines and all of these things that go directly into success and or failure on the battlefield and leadership and the quality of generals. You know, it can be pretty broad, but for most of history, there were certain categories that it worked within. And in truth, for certain military confrontations and conflicts in history, that actually is more than sufficient. And it's still actually quite sufficient. There's obviously each branch of history has something valuable to give us, and you could get a lot of mileage out of this kind of more rigorous and limited military historical view. And this was often applied to, in the past, the American Revolution, at least when looking at the successful war effort of the Patriots, you know, against the British. However, you know, the historical professions and what historians bring to the table when they string together a narrative to tell the story of history isn't just what they pull out of archives and primary sources and first-person accounts and diaries, right? All of that's important, right? That is the building blocks of history. But they're also conditioned by their own times, by their own experiences and the civilizations they live in. And I assure you, they think a lot and observe a lot of the civilizations they live in. They're informed by that as well. And we'll see, as civilization and society and culture and history itself changes, the way we interpret history, the tools and the analyses we bring to history will also change. And there was a pretty interesting point I want to sort of say is that, you know, after America's experience, the world's experience of war in the 20th century, right? World War I and World War II are these massive global wars, and then particularly as we move into the later 20th century and America and the Europeans, right, become these global superpowers, right? That the very experience of war, the nature of war, what it meant to be at war actually changes as well. In fact, if we look at the post-1950s world, most wars, even the wars that America is engaged in, are colonial rebellions. They're civil wars. They're guerrilla insurgencies, right? There's a whole world of wars. And probably as far as writing of American history and the sort of changing of how we look at war and analyze war, there's probably no greater event than the Vietnam War, right? America's experience in Vietnam introduced both America and America's intellectuals to a whole new category for looking at military history, the history of war. And it broadened it. And the reason it broadened it has to do with this, is that the old categories, the rather rigid categories of military history surrounding strategy, technology, superior weaponry, good leadership and tactics, and even looking at supply and manufacture, didn't tell the story. It couldn't explain wins and losses in that war. In most of these wars, right? We could say, like, we could be pretty clear about this. You know, the superpowers, the Americans, can win most of the battles. And this is true for the French in Algeria, and it's true later for the Soviets in Afghanistan. I mean, this is, you know, becomes the face of war after the 1950s. You could win most of the battles. You could occupy most of the territory. From an old strategic, specific analyses, you would won the war. And yet, at the end of these long insurgencies, colonial rebellions, civil wars, they lost. Right? Something else happened. And it has to do with this idea of, and I will give you a more rigorous definition in a minute, but something called asymmetrical warfare, right? We have this experience of sort of unequal war, a whole different face of war, in which the experience of war itself relied on something more, something outside the realm of pure militarism, right? That other issues, cultural issues, social issues, and political issues were at play. And we're going to talk about why in a minute. We'll move over and I'll do some definitions and we'll come back to this idea. But what we see, and the argument of this particular lecture is that starting after World War II, and really after the experience of Vietnam, and certainly after the experience of the 1990s into the early 21st century of modern war, there is a new expanded view of how we can analyze military conflicts, not just in our own time, but in the past. That we import a more mature and nuanced and somewhat complicated view of military conflict, not just in how we analyze and strategize and prepare for war in modern times, but to how we can flesh out and further understand and reinterpret the wars of history, right? The wars of our past. And specifically, for our purposes, the American Revolution. How does the American Revolution fit into this kind of new narrative analytical framework? So let's do a few definitions first. The first idea I want to come up is something called asymmetrical war. Asymmetrical war. And this is a term we've started to hear more and more of lately, right? You hear the news people talk about this. It's a more popular way to look at war. And basically, it refers to a war in which the belligerents, the two sides fighting, are unequal. One side is far more powerful and advanced in terms of its military, usually its economics, its population. You know, it has a much larger, more powerful, more dynamic, well-supplied, professionally trained military, right? Military power and capability. And where the other side is drastically inferior on that particular level. It cannot stand up to the other side in a head-to-head conventional war conflict. If it does, it would be wiped out. So the war is asymmetrical, uneven. The two sides aren't the same. And again, we can look at this. We can look at America in Vietnam, or the Soviets in Afghanistan, the French in Algeria, the Americans in Afghanistan, the Americans in Iraq, right? Where, you know, ultimately, as far as the pure conventional contest between these powers go, there was no contest, right? The Soviets or the Americans, the French, whoever, overwhelmed the other sides pretty early on. But the content of the war continues, and the face of the war changes greatly because of this asymmetry. Which brings me to the second part of what's also asymmetrical. It's not just the military and the military capability themselves are asymmetrical. The strategies employed are vastly different from each side, right? The more powerful side will typically, right, try to use what's to its advantage. It will try to overwhelm in fast, quick, coordinated movements their opponents using superior technology and military might. The strategies, however, employed from the weaker side in an asymmetrical warfare are often called often unconventional strategies, right? They'll use guerrilla warfare, where they don't directly engage the main body of their opponents. It's quick and fast-acting attacks. They will target soft targets. They'll target civilians, right? They'll create terror. They'll use all sorts of manners of insurgency, right? Because they can't really directly combat their opponents in a direct conventional manner. They'll lose. And the main goal for them is resistance, survival. And in fact, another big part of this unconventional warfare, and it is an important part of the strategy, is political, right? Is that often what they need to do is maintain popular support and the will to continue fighting. And part of that way that's done is, one, by not being defeated militarily and staying relevant to some level in your application of violence. But also, you have to win over the populace, right? Often in these sort of wars, we see that not everyone is on either side, right? There are people who are neutral, who are in the middle, who just want stability and peace and security. And to win their support, and not just their passive support, ultimately, these wars are often decided by who can win the active support of those in the middle. And in order to do that, we'll see people acting in a more political way. If I were to use a modern example, I might call to mind Hezbollah in Lebanon and Syria, right? That they fight these asymmetrical wars against Israel for years and now in Syria, and they certainly have both a conventional and an unconventional insurgent approach to fighting. But they also function in certain areas as a charitable society. They give mutual aid, they provide law and order, right? And they do this because that's the political side of fighting an asymmetrical war. That's the other part of also winning over. You use terror and violence. Sometimes they do use conventional war. They will actually have actual, battles head to head. But you also have a political side. And that's another thing that we often see in these asymmetrical wars. And it shouldn't be lost on anyone that asymmetrical warfare, right, has, for the most part, become the face of modern warfare. That is the face of 1950s warfare, right? There's some examples that maybe break with that. But by and large, no matter who we're looking at, we're either looking at civil wars in third world countries, strong governments trying to press, other, guerrilla Marxist movements, or you have, again, like I said, American Vietnam is perhaps, the real sort of watershed experience as far as the West is concerned. But there are others, and this is continued. And that's the nature of asymmetrical warfare. And to further flesh that out, because we're going to come back to it in a second, I just want to come up with another idea. And these are long-standing military history ways of looking at war. And one is called a war of maneuver versus a war of attrition, okay? And I should say there's actually a couple of wars. There's a war in Israel in the 1960s actually called the War of Attrition. And it is a war of attrition, but I mean, as we'll see, I'm talking very general. There's sort of a general definition of how to look at wars, how to interpret wars historically, even contemporary. So a war of maneuver. A war of maneuver is basically, well, it's symmetrical warfare, right? It's war between two relatively equal powers, or maybe multiple equal powers, right? It's often decided through quick, fast-moving battlefield actions. Ultimately, that when you have the collision of these powers, the wars of maneuver will be settled on the battlefield. They could take a long time, they can go quick, but ultimately, battlefield victories determines who wins these wars. Classic examples, the Napoleonic Wars, right? We have Napoleon, he launches these battles and he wins quickly against the Austrians and the Germans, right? And he becomes the master of those areas for a while. And then he's ultimately defeated, right, by the British and their allies at the Battle of Waterloo. And that battle is decisive. That ends, the Napoleonic era, right? Battlefield contests decided the outcome of the war and the outcome of those societies after the war. And military historians, classic military historians, love wars of maneuver, right? I should also say World War II, for the most part, is a war of maneuver. It's a long war of maneuver. But ultimately, the great battles of World War II, the Battle of Midway, the Battle of the Bulge, Normandy, right? All the great battles, do ultimately determine the outcome of that war. It's a very broad war, so there is obviously asymmetrical components as well. But largely speaking, much like the Napoleonic Wars, military historians who want to look at this, they can focus on the more sort of classic categories of military history and come up with really good analyses and explanations for why one side won and why one side lost, right? You look at technology, of superior weaponry, the amount of training and preparation. You could look at specific battlefield strategy and tactics and the caliber and the character of the military leaders, right? And you could expand that to also including, manufacturing and distribution and logistics. All of that fits usually pretty nicely, and you can get a very rich and pretty good picture of the why in the history of military history. But there's another type of warfare, right? And largely speaking, we could call it a war of attrition. Now, war of attrition basically is sort of a slow, grinding style of warfare, right? It's more typical of civil wars and colonial wars, right? But basically, it's when battlefields and quick battlefield contests don't yield results, right? They don't really do much to actually change the face of the war or to determine who wins and who loses. Ultimately, you have superior forces are unable to achieve quick victories, and what grows out of this, the contest becomes less and less about military strategy, right, in that sort of sense we were talking about before, and more of a contest of political and social and cultural will, right? And what you see is ultimately two sides grinding each other down, or sometimes multiple sides, until one of the sides loses, political and cultural and sometimes monetary will to continue the fight. I mean, that's ultimately how these are decided. And I should say all wars of attrition all wars of attrition are not civil wars and colonial rebellions. I mean, I guess the classic grand war of attrition, the first time this term is really used, is World War I, right? That they hit this stalemate, in eastern France, and it just stays that way for years in a slow, grinding war until really one side is exhausted over the other and can no longer marshal the political, monetary, and economic will to continue the fight, right? So that is probably the grandest. However, much of the other wars in the 20th century, again, from Algeria to Vietnam to Iraq after we depose of Saddam Hussein, to Afghanistan for the Soviets and for the Russians, for the Americans and the Russians in southern Russia and the Caucasian regions, all of those sort of wars are wars of attrition. Quick battlefield action is certainly part of the story, and the conquests happen, but the war doesn't end. It doesn't pivot on those successes, right? So, and what we see is basically, and like I said, I like to come back to Vietnam because the historians who write after that period are the first ones to really begin to apply this to things like the American Revolution. We win most of the battles, right? We successfully, occupy huge chunks. And at the end of 12 years, however, we've lost the population. And more importantly, the Viet Cong outlast America's will to continue that fight. We lose the political fight at home. People no longer wish to participate in a draft. They don't want to send their children off to those wars, and they don't want to pay for it anymore either, right? That it's actually a contest of political wills. One side wears out the other. There's definitely a direct military strategic component to it, but there's more to it than that. You have to have a much broader analytical framework, right? And most of these wars of attrition will be asymmetrical wars. That's the connection. They are these asymmetrical wars in which much of the fighting and much of the way the war is won and lost will be using these unconventional methods of insurgency and guerrilla warfare, but also this sort of political and propagandistic side, cultural side of winning these wars is part of the grand strategy. And what I'd like to say is, so starting around the 1970s, there's a couple of really wonderful historians. In fact, I'm going to write one's name down just because his work really, I don't know if people read it enough anymore, and look it up. People, Numerous and Armed is his best book. Guy's name is John Shai. And try Charles Royster is another one who's really good. They're the first ones who really kind of look at America's experience in Vietnam, the experience of these sort of asymmetrical, unconventional wars. And he's actually a hardcore military historian, but he's the first one to really introduce this more broad view of military history that includes lots of cultural and social and political elements into our understanding of how wars are won and lost and what successful strategies were and should be in order to win these asymmetrical wars. And John Shai specifically applies this to the American Revolution. And it's groundbreaking. It's a real departure from what comes before. And it's daring, because to be honest, we're messing with one of the true sacred cows in American historiography is the American Revolution, right? The question is, should we look at the American Revolution this way, as an insurgency, a colonial rebellion, a resistance movement? I would argue we should. It also does have a strong conventional component as well. There's definitely a symmetrical war part that is part of this experience as well, right? So we have a symmetrical war. With the Continental Army eventually becomes a pretty mature professional fighting unit. That goes without question. But much of this battle is fought in an asymmetrical way, right? One of the first things that we should point out, and I'm going to come back to this, is most of the violence in the Revolutionary War is not between the Continental Army of the Patriots and the British Professional Army. Most of the violence is between loyalist colonial citizens and patriot colonial citizens. And that tells you there's something else also going on here that is bigger and more complex than just conventional wars of maneuver. And it's definitely a war of attrition. And so we have to have the tools and the sensibility to also look at this as an asymmetrical, unconventional war, and look at what strategies ultimately the Patriots employed, right, in unconventional warfare style that enabled their victory against the world's #1 superpower of the time, right, the British Empire. They are the superpower. The Patriots are the colonial insurgency. We have to be able to fit that in, and we have to understand also where the British failed to recognize that they were fighting this sort of a war, because they do. That's part of the story. That part of the story is British strategic failures and colonial patriotic strategic successes. But those strategies we're looking at are not just conventional war strategies. They're part of the story, but they're not all of it. There's an unconventional part, an insurgent part, a resistance part that we also have to wrap our heads around. And you'll see as you watch the films and you read through the material of this particular topic where this applies. It's been argued in asymmetrical war of attrition that it's more important, thinking about what we said, for the leaders and the generals to be good politicians than good strategic military generals. Listen, it's great to be a good strategic military general, and it's certainly great to have a great idea about tactics. But ultimately, in these sort of resistance movements, your political skills matter more, right? You have to be able to basically keep the cause alive, sometimes in face of overwhelming military force, right? That's part of the thing. The British early on have all the victories. They overwhelm them, and you have to keep your cause alive. The second thing you have to do, and this is how you win, because winning comes from not defeating them on open battlefields so much as keeping the cause alive. You have to win new supporters. You have to keep the people who support you and keep them ardently, but you're also fighting to gain support from the rest of the population, right? That is the huge part of this story. You have to win new supporters. And don't forget, many people in this society are reluctant. They're reluctant to participate, and they may be hostile to you. And winning their support, ending their reluctance and bringing them in, that's a political job, right? That is a cultural job, a social job. It goes beyond mere military strategy. You have to convince everyone that their future, their security, their hope for stability lies with you and your cause. And that's where it is, and not with anybody else's cause, certainly not with the British in this particular case, right? They have to become convinced that the only future available to them is with you. And that's political. It's propaganda. It's a lot of different things, but it's not just militarily. You know, time and consistency are really the key things that ultimately help an insurgency win in these asymmetrical wars. You know, I would say, and this is why, you know, years ago, people would look at George Washington and they would often fault him. Historians would fault him for not being militarily brilliant, right? Sometimes they'd say he's lucky, he's like, you know, but he was brilliant. He was the perfect leader for this sort of war, because he had all of the bearing and the sensibility to be a great political leader as well as a great general, right? He, in many ways, in his own personhood, hold together the resistance, takes the right policy, strategics, and tactics that keeps the army alive, that ultimately wins over, like, the reluctant part of the population, and of course, as we know, becomes, you know, this sort of hero of legendary status, whose very personhood, you know, is the embodiment of this new national unity. I mean, that's really the glory of George Washington. In many ways, if you want to evaluate whether or not George Washington is a great general, it all depends on how you look at war. If you're looking at it as a pure war of maneuver, maybe not, right? But if we look at it from this terms of a war of attrition and an asymmetrical war, all of a sudden his cleverness and his creativity and his true leadership and grand strategic sense of what needed to be done to win this war is almost beyond compare. Like, he's one of the greatest military leaders in that particular regard. He was the right man for the job. You know, and again, this is a war of attrition, of a rebel insurgency, a colonial rebel insurgency against a global superpower, the British military. I want to give you one more little kind of diagram and way to look at this. There's something kind of called, and this helps explain how this really is a war of attrition and an insurgency. It's called a triangular war, that sometimes is called the triangularity of war. Triangular war. So who are the belligerents, right? Well, on one side, we have the patriots. Right? These are colonial citizens who have openly engaged in insurrection against the British Empire, right? They would actually often call themselves, as well as they call themselves, Whigs. It's a political identity. And in direct confrontation, they're actually fighting two groups that were unified. They're fighting against the British, and they're also fighting against the Loyalists. You know, Loyalists, and they actually organized themselves into highly effective militias. The Loyalists are also colonial citizens. They're the colonial citizens who are willing to take up arms and join at a martial level, you know, the British occupation against the Patriots. And here's the thing. The Loyalists represent about a third of the population. The Whigs represent about a third of the population. So we'll get into a point here in a minute. But if we look at this, one thing I do want to say, when we think about why we have to look at this as both a conventional war and an unconventional war, an asymmetrical war, is the Patriots weren't just fighting a war against the British, right, a war of colonial rebellion. They're also fighting a civil war. There's also a civil war, which I already told you is where most of the violence actually happens in the Revolution. And what they're ultimately fighting for, and this is where it's triangular, is another group. They're trying to win the loyalty and the support of the neutrals, who didn't call themselves neutrals, but they are. They're neutral. And again, at the start of the war, it's about a third of the population, right? So we have the third of the population. And, you know, the neutrals, you know what the neutrals want? They want the same thing. They want security and stability. Security and stability. Same thing here, I'd say. I'm going to say security and stability. That's what they want. And ultimately, they will ultimately throw in and join with the side that they think guarantees, or gives them the best guarantee in the end, of security and stability. Listen, we've talked about this. The late 18th century colonial America is a place of a lot of economic success and growth. It's a very stable society and secure society prior to the outbreak of the American Revolution. And there's just people who want to go back to enjoying the wealth they were making, their comfortable family lives, their market farming, right? And, you know, this war causes chaos. And ultimately, there's going to be a struggle. That the struggle isn't just the military, direct military confrontation between these two groups, but it's to win. And this is this phrase, boy, if I had a nickel for every time CNN uses this phrase referring to our own military strategies, they need to win the hearts and minds. The hearts and minds, I love that phrase, the hearts and minds of the general population, of these neutrals, right? Because that's what a revolution is. An insurgency is an ideologically driven movement, and they need to not only just have these guys remain neutral, you need to actually win them and their passion and their actual physical military commitment, their hearts and their minds to your cause. And the way you do that, and this is the unconventional aspect of the war, is you have to pretty much let them know, politically, militarily, and all different sort of strategies, that their future stability and security, because that's what they really care about. If that wasn't paramount to them, they would have joined one of these two sides. The fact that they're not on either side tells you that all they want is stability and security. You have to convince them that the only future they have, the only stable and secure future they have, is with your side. Right? That is the ultimate struggle. That is the triangularity of war. And as we know, even the most casual observer of modern warfare, particularly if we look at America's modern war engagements in the Middle East and Central Asia, okay, we see this struggle. We hear people talk about this struggle. After the 1970s, the experience of Vietnam, not only military historians, but military strategists, right? People in the Defense Department begin to develop strategies and tactics to also think about what is required to win these asymmetrical wars. How do you win the hearts and minds of the general populace? Because one of the ways the British will ultimately fail, what they will fail is they don't try to win the hearts and minds of the neutrals. All they do is try to keep the neutrals neutral, right? They take the neutrals' lack of fighting and interest for granted. Right? And they constantly try to focus until the very, very end. They do, in the final phases, kind of come up with an idea of how do we, you know, bring the neutrals more to our side. But for most of the war, they still see it as a more war of a maneuver, right? That there's just this direct confrontation between themselves and the loyalists and this patriot insurgency. And by ignoring the neutrals, and conversely by the patriots really focusing on winning over the neutrals, this war has changed. You know, by the end of the war, over 2/3 of the people, or 2/3 of fighting age men between the age of 16 and 45 have enlisted and spent some time in the Continental Army fighting against the British. And that is a sea change from the huge amount of reluctance among a large percentage of the population at the start of the war. And that didn't just come about from strategic military victories. It came about from a fairly focused, often violent, political effort to win over the neutrals, okay? So coming back to all of this, I think most people listening to this could say yes. After World War II, this is a fairly acceptable way to view asymmetrical war. Many of the wars, since we've become a superpower and other superpowers engage in, unless we ever get around to fighting another superpower. And we could even say that it makes sense that this should be part of any grand military strategy in modern times. The question is, for you, is it the way to look at the American Revolution? As I often like to point out, this is one point of view. It's one I think that is pretty accurate, and I think really helps to flesh out and explain the American military and social success during this war, right? That the pure strategic way of looking at this is not enough, or that the strategies we have to have in mind are the strategies that go with a war of attrition, right? Because ultimately, the way this war is won, right, is the British win most of the big battles. They conquer almost all the seaboard cities except for Boston, right? And and hold them for almost the entirety of the war. They establish a successful blockade. And in the end, though, they lose. They lose the colonies. And one of the biggest ways they lose is that support at home eventually evaporates, right? That the tax-paying citizens lose their political will, and the politicians that represent them also lose their political will to continue this war, to keep throwing money and effort towards controlling the colonial insurgency. And as time went on, the number of people who will eventually flip over to the patriot cause just grows and grows, to the point where, frankly, the colonies can be militarily conquered, but they're ungovernable, right? You can't govern them. And that is, and how that happens, how those strategies are applied to make that the reality in the colonies is I think is at the very heart of the military, social, cultural history of the American Revolution. There are others who would argue against this. There are other ways to look at the American Revolution. There's some who might just have a real hesitancy applying such a modernist view of war and conflict to an older, much older historical war. What the right analytical approach is up for you to decide. This is the one I've presented you at the beginning of this particular topic. I'd like you to have it in mind, okay? It's just something for you to think about. Thank you.